I'd rather stick to the development in Japan about the accessibility of the built environment in Japan. I'll talk about how we developed the accessibility of the buildings in Japan. Japan was very slow to respond in earlier years. And we had the accessible building law in 1994 that had no requirements, just recommendation. And only years after, some mandatory clauses introduced in 2002. Why? Next slide, please. Year 2000, we had accessible public transportation law. And this introduction worked, as it had obligation for new ones. But it was also slow to renovate existing infrastructure. When we had our first international conference for university design in 2002, the Tokaido Shinkansen and others were not ready for accessibility. Very few stations had elevators. There was some for administrative use, but not for the passengers. So it took very long years for them to be accessible. Next slide, please. So gradual improvement was done on buildings. Oh. So actually, in addition to the revision of 2002, which asked for requirements for the larger scale buildings, there was also the need for structural reinforcement against earthquakes. That was due to Great Hanshin earthquake in 1995. And so many of the buildings that the owners had were sensible enough to renovate, they had the buildings scrap and build, demolish and build a new one. So newer buildings, particularly large-scale ones, are competing to each other, whether they are newer and more accessible, usable, and more comfortable. But still, nowadays, smaller buildings are slow to respond. Particularly in those smaller buildings, we have the small businesses. So we are still waiting for them to be renovated. Next slide. But so what the law required is a kind of minimum. So that's not actually advisable because there are fewer than accessible number of facilities as minimum. So one route is enough, which actually meant for the stations, only one accessible route was enough. It definitely cannot accommodate many number of passengers and not accommodate many number of building users in a larger scale building. And so one accessible toilet was enough for a whole building, however big that building was. So, but those are now revised to be more reasonably accommodated. And that's thanks to the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities and Japanese law requiring reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation, with the concept of reasonable accommodation, you have to have more number of toilets and more number of toilets, particularly on every floor. So the lesson we learned, and we can tell you that you should learn, is that the goal is for equity, equal for everybody. And so needs of the people must be fulfilled, preferably without delay and without extra cost, which will mean that everybody will appreciate the full chance of participation, experience, and enjoy the whole daily life. So it will lead to everyone's satisfaction in the end. I think this is the end of my presentation, but I would like to add one thing. Yes. As Joseph referred to the flooding. Uh, we also have the flooding in many places, and although we have had the people to let people choose wherever to want to build, but we are now going to the direction that we are just suggesting people just avoid the places where the flooding is likely to occur. As to the fire safety, most of the requirements are reasonably acceptable for the most of the users. But what we have been having in recent years is arson, which the fires were triggered. And in such cases, even people without disabilities, who are assumed to be able to evacuate through evacuation routes, are trapped and caught, and they are dead. So we are just thinking about how we can persuade people to go into the better direction for more fire safety. Thank you very much for my presentation.